Hi, I'm Natasha Sinyanovich, and this is Women Like Sex, a myth-busting podcast that examines the many, many medical, scientific, and social facts about female sexuality that were never, in fact, facts. Especially the very modern-day belief that women don't like sex as much as men do. I'll be speaking with experts, educators, friends, comedians, and more across a spectrum of ages, genders, and cultures to flip the scripts on myths and misconceptions that have long been dictated by not women. Together, we'll replace so much inaccurate messaging with healthier, smarter, factual facts and get the sex ed we wished we'd gotten. Hey everyone, some exciting news. Podcast swag is now available through womenlikesex.com. Among other things, you can buy yourself a hat with a clitoris on it and proudly wear it around with maybe only a few people knowing what it is. As for this week's guest, Dr. Cynthia Graham is a distinguished professor of gender studies at Indiana University and a senior scientist at the Kinsey Institute, one of the world's leading sex research centers for nearly 80 years. Her current research includes male condom use, sexual problems, women's sexual pleasure, and sexual health among older adults. She has countless accolades and has been editor-in-chief of the Journal of Sex Research since 2009. She was also part of the work group on sexual and gender identity disorders for the 5th edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or DSM, which we discuss for its misleading past definitions of sexual problems and how those definitions are slowly improving, surprisingly for women more so than for men. And to my great joy, she agrees with my idea that certain messaging about women is as bad as if we told men that their proper way to orgasm is rectally. But first, Cynthia debunks one of the worst and maybe most enraging pieces of modern data that's been floating around for decades.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. I've been wanting to talk to you since I read your 2017 paper, I believe, called Women's Sexual Desire, Challenging Narratives of Dysfunction. It lies at the intersection of so many things that interest me, beginning with the very definition of sex that everybody has been working with. Those of you who are sexologists actually working with, and us mere mortals having still in our lives.
Yeah, I think that's changing. I think the definition of sex has changed, but it's slow. It's slow. And I think that the whole concept too, relatedly, of sexual dysfunction is changing and becoming more stringent. Whenever I teach, on sexuality, obviously, I use the word dysfunction in quotes.
Thank you.
People throw it around and, just maybe this is maybe too early to say, but I was really struck by you asking about the 40% of women, 43% it is actually,
right,
in the States have a sexual dysfunction. And that, although that statistic has been heavily criticized, we did in that paper, but so have many others, it's still used in papers. And I still, as an editor, I still receive scientific manuscripts which start with over 40% of American women have a sexual dysfunction.
When I read that the first time, I thought, first of all, a 1 in 2 occurrence rate, right? That's basically 1 in 2. That's not a dysfunction. The problem is elsewhere, and the problem is in how we define sex. And so if we define it through a very, very narrow lens, then the people who don't get pleasure, and it's been very androcentric and penis-centric.
And it's also, though, based on a question from a large-scale survey that just asked, have you had sexual problems in the last several months? That's all it asked.
Oh, wow.
Going by the DSM criteria, as the dysfunction's only used when somebody is distressed, moderately to very distressed about a problem. So that 43% is hugely inflated. And some of the better studies by far, including the UK, the British National Survey, representative survey, suggest that the actual figure for women who have a sexual dysfunction is around 4%, 5%. So they just actually look at any sexual difficulties, which are common and can be adaptive, right? You may have a sexual problem because you're in a very bad relationship, or you're with a partner who doesn't provide any stimulation.
Right.
All of those things, those are all just taken out of the situation and they just swing that label on. I am stunned that after that long, you still see that 43% figure in papers.
It drives me crazy. And I've been telling people that can't be right since long before I thought of doing this project. And I just thought, think about it. And I've said that to women who say, really, it's that low. I would think more. It comes back to how much we think of women as being broken because sex has been P and V, and I will talk about it a lot in this project, this podcast, penis and vagina, ejaculation plus stimulation. The amount of damage that this has done and the amount of people who feel broken because of this is profound. And I wanted to jump in with something I wrote you that when I was telling a friend that I was going to be interviewing you and talked about your paper, his response was, yeah, I get it. That's wrong. He understood, but then said, well, because you also talk about quote unquote female Viagra. And he said, is it just a question of if women took some kind of over the counter drug or pot or just marijuana, their defenses would lower and then they could orgasm, enjoy sex more, which really means orgasm, again, quote unquote, vaginally through vaginal stimulation, even though the vagina has no nerve endings, or it has some, but very few.
Very few.
And so I told him, I was like, well, imagine how broken men would be. And am I completely off on this, saying, imagine how broken men would be if for millennia everyone had been telling you that your best and only and most mature route to orgasm was somebody sticking a finger up your bum. Some people would say, well, yeah, I like that, but most would say that's actually not. It's actually if you touch this other part of me that I get more pleasure. Is that an accurate comparison?
I think it's a great comparison. I've never heard that before. But the thing about what your friend said is there's no evidence that it's because women are not relaxed and they just need that. That goes back to people saying if they've seen a doctor and mention anything about sex and orgasm, that's the kind of reaction they get. Go and have a glass of wine and relax and so on. There's no evidence that during clitoral stimulation, which you're right, has been labeled as immature, that a lot of women have problems with penetrative sex, penis and vagina reaching an orgasm. Some don't, but many do.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, that shouldn't be labeled a dysfunction, right? When the majority of women have orgasm during some kind of stimulation that's not penile vaginal. That is changing. And we have so much research on this now, really, really high quality research. So we know, for example, women in relationships with women, some of it from the Kinsey, by the way, here,
Right.
orgasm frequency just as high as men do. There's no difference. It's when we're talking about straight women having sex with straight men, as you said, PIV sex, penetrative sex, and we know that that's not something that occurs, and we know that, in fact, it is changing. We've just done a survey. We've done 2 surveys recently of women over 60, and some really positive. Papers are under review, but some really positive findings are orgasms don't necessarily get worse, which is what the sort of narrative is. With aging, they sometimes improve. And they sometimes, most often rather, stay the same. Going back to your question, I think that idea is changing. However, the whole idea about a female Viagra, that's how it's usually labeled, there's no evidence that anything like Viagra would work with women. They discontinued that research program years ago because they found that using Viagra, actual Viagra, with women in a lab-based situation, it did increase vaginal blood flow. But guess what? It didn't increase arousal. Having increased blood flow to the vagina without actually feeling turned on, who cares about that?
Right. Oh,
It's a male model, right? The idea that if you give something to women that increases genital response only, not that that's not important, it can be important, it's part of the piece, but it's not what women come in to a clinic and say. And women don't generally come in and say, problem is lack of lubrication, unless they're having menopausal symptoms that are really, marked.
mm-hmm.
They come in and say, I don't feel aroused. And that's a whole other thing. And how that's treated or how clients improve is very different as well. So, we've known for years that masturbation, guided masturbation, as it's called, back to the 70s, one of the previous directors, Julia Hyman, did a lot of research on that. That's an effective treatment for women not reaching orgasm. The other thing is, just to add to what you've said, I think that there's another myth around, and that's that sex has to always be perfect.
Right.
Being very involved, not doing the trials, but very involved and following what happened with the approval of the 2 drugs that have been approved in the US for treatment of desire problems, not arousal problems. That idea in the testimonials, in the hearings, the FDA hearings, where women were testifying, really supports that idea that they think it should be exactly the same with a partner as it was in the first week when they got together. It should be just as exciting, just as spontaneous. There's a lot of evidence that spontaneous sex isn't necessarily better. There's a recent study on that, actually. So planned sex can be just as good. So that idea that it never should get worse with age, with childbirth, postpartum, and going back to the 43%, even worse than that, I see papers that say at 6 months postpartum, 60% of women have a sexual dysfunction. It actually makes me so angry that this idea that nothing should change when you just had a baby and you're postpartum and you probably or maybe breastfeeding. It drives me wild.
You're probably tired and underslept and have a lot of things on your mind. But to go back to the spontaneity, it took me a long time to understand that. I also had this idea well into, I don't even know what age, but this idea of like, well, if you postpone or if you say, let's stick a pin in that, or let's, in the morning, like right now I'm tired, or later this afternoon, we just don't have time or ran out of time or whatever it is, that it could not be as fun, and then realized, oh, if anything, the idea of, ooh, it's coming up.
I did one study with Stephanie Sanders here at Kinsey where we found exactly that. This was a group of very mixed age women's qualitative interviews, right, and focus groups. And they talked about anticipation being a real turn on. And how they did it was really variable. But, some of them said their partner or they would leave their partner little notes on the table at breakfast. And then the whole day, they said they were thinking about looking forward to that afternoon or that evening or whatever. So, and there was a recent study that actually pretty good study quality-wise that compared spontaneous sex with planned sex. No difference in terms of enjoyment or anything related to positive, sexuality.
We have such misguided ideas to our detriment, right? Such narrow definitions of sex and what is sexy and what is appropriate. But I want to go back to what you said about drugs that work on desire rather than arousal. What does that mean? What are those drugs? What do they do?
Good question. So they're quite different drugs. They've both been approved now. I always forget the exact year, but one more quite recent. Both were recently approved. Essentially, they act on the brain, and they basically, one of them is that's what it's called, a failed antidepressant. So it was trialed, it was tested as an antidepressant, didn't work, but some, of the researchers noted that some, not all, some women said they had an increase in sexual interest while they took. A little bit like what happened with Viagra was not developed to treat erectile dysfunction. It was a serendipitous finding. And so it's similar with this. Very different than Viagra, which acts really locally. To be honest, I've read a lot about these drugs. They don't really understand exactly why they work. But I have, since it started, I've had grave concerns about the use of these. I should really look up how much they're selling now. But when the second one was approved, it was approved only with what's called a black box warning, highest warning that FDA can give. You were not allowed to drink alcohol at all, like zero, while taking the drug. And if you look at the trial data, which somebody has and submitted some reanalysis, they suggest that the researchers did really cherry pick the data. There was a very low efficacy rate. More women in the placebo group, so the non-active drug group, preferred the placebo to the pill group. It was a carefully controlled trial, but the FDA was very swayed by a grassroots campaign called Even the Score. And it was a group of women who got together. That can be really good. But in this case, pushing the drug with some real misleading information. What Even the Score meant was they claimed 26-0, that men had 26 drugs to treat their sexual problems and women had zero. Highly misleading. There's no drugs that are effective for sexual desire problems in men. That's number one. Number two, almost all of those 26, maybe all of them, are some variants of testosterone or of Viagra.
You bring up Viagra. Speaking to your communications, the Kinsey's communications person, Camilla, when I was reaching out to set up this interview and with other colleagues of yours, she mentioned that there's Kinsey research going on right now with some Swiss partners on Viagra, and they keep losing participants because they're finding that the problems that the men are having are more trauma related than anything else. So they cure them, they treat them, they help them face the trauma, and then they no longer need Viagra.
I actually don't know about that study. I think it's by someone who's still linked to the Kinsey, but it's not based here. I'm pretty sure I know who it's done by, but I hadn't heard of that. Viagra was absolutely transformational. It was huge, in 1998, but it's not. It has some negative consequences too, I think. So it has encouraged, I think, kind of quick fix idea. And as someone that did sex therapy for years here in the States, but also in Britain and in Canada, sexual problems are rarely not related to something to do with the relationship, either the sexual relationship or the general relationship. So one of the things about Viagra that we saw here years ago, because I was at the Kinsey much earlier for 9 years, is that sometimes when a man is prescribed Viagra, he's very pleased about it, happy it's working. If he has a female partner, the female partner isn't always. And so in the study done here by two of my colleagues, the women often said, I don't really like it that it's like on demand. They thought there were a lot of other things that should be worked on in their sexual relationship rather than just having an erection.
Such as?
Talking about stimulation for the other partner.
Right.
Number one, variety. There is a researcher, sadly she passed away, but in Amsterdam, Ellen Laan, a great sex researcher, and she wrote a lot about that lack of stimulation is a major reason why women, if you look at rates of orgasm, women have orgasm less frequently than men. And there's another researcher in Germany who's actually stating the same things with her research too. So lack of communication is a huge issue. I'll give you one example, but it's a striking one. In a study I did with what's called the NatSal team, so it's a very big nationally representative survey, thousands of people in the UK. It's in its fourth wave now. This was a study I led on. What we found is that low sexual interest, the biggest predictor of that was lack of communication with one's sexual partner about likes and dislikes. The biggest predictor, and we looked at a lot of different variables. People often think they don't have to talk about sex, that they just have to, or about contraception. That's one of the areas I work in.
Mm.
And women particularly, I think it may not be sexy to ask for what you want in bed.
I think so many women have also been told to not ask, or made to feel so ashamed and so confused about their own bodies and urges. This project is called Women Like Sex for a very simple reason, because it still scandalizes people. It doesn't ring true for so many people in the modern world. Before the modern world, women liked sex and how, for different reasons. And even then that was that was wrong, and it was dictated by men. I mean, not wrong, but men were chaste and women were hypersexual, and today we have the other way around. But when you were talking, I just thought of this idea of communication and how hard it is. There are the social reasons, and then there are, like you said, this reason that it's not sexy. But if you don't talk, it's like going out to eat for dinner, and one person just saying, I want to eat this kind of food. I only want Italian. I only want burritos. I only want steak. And the other person just going along. And at some point, you would say, let's go eat somewhere else where we can both. And nobody's ashamed of that.
Yeah, yeah. And going back to what else helps apart from things like Viagra, for years now, one of the most common sex therapy approaches still used in sort of adapted ways is going back to let's actually not have intercourse and let's do other things. Have a ban. It's called a ban on intercourse, and go back to touching, genital touching, but also non-genital touching as well. And in the research we've done, some of these things were rated as hugely as enhancers of arousal. And the style of approach, how a partner or how you approach a partner is really important. All these other things, rather than just having, before the DSM was changed in 2013, that was the last DSM-5. Before that, the only criteria for sexual arousal disorder was lack of lubrication. That's it. So it was seen as the equivalent of erection in men. And I can tell you that, again, although vaginal dryness is an issue for some women, particularly postmenopausal, it's not what brings people into clinics. They don't say, I have no vaginal lubrication, but that was the sole criterion for sexual arousal. And the sole criterion for sexual interest disorder was called hypoactive sexual desire disorder before.
Mm-hmm.
Now has a different name, was lack of fantasies, not fantasizing, which is hugely problematic because we know that not all women fantasize, number one. And not having any of the other criteria for being interested or responsive, that's also interest, right? Being responsive to a partner or initiating, but it was only lack of or reduced frequency of sexual fantasy.
So no fantasies and no lubrication. And really, lubrication, what we're talking about, is what helps men orgasm.
Yeah.
Because for women, I mean, yes, there are women who just find penetrative sex very, very pleasurable, regardless of orgasm. Again, it doesn't have to be this achievement, this, as you write, even this goal-oriented sex doesn't have to be goal-oriented in that sense. Or my understanding of what you wrote was just such pressure and focus on the orgasm. But if we are talking orgasm, lubrication is what brings men and straight penetrative sex to orgasm, and not necessarily a woman.
Yeah, for sure. And we also know that lubrication, it depends on things like hormonal factors. There's all kinds of things that would make someone more or less lubricated, right? Well, as mentioned, menopause too. I really do think, though, looking at one of your questions that you sent me, I do think things are changing. And a good example of that is in the last, it's probably been about 15, 20 years, there's been a lot more qualitative work on women's sexuality. Before that, there was very little, but qualitative work is really, and in contrast, there's still been relatively little qualitative, where you're asking men or women themselves, right, how they feel, very little on men. So when the DSM was changed in 2013, it changed radically for women. We made proposals for deleting disorders and introducing ones that were very different, including the one for pain, very different than DSM-3 before. But for men, we made almost no changes.
Hmm.
And the reason for that, because we were asked to rely on research, we had to produce evidence for proposals we had, is that we didn't have much on men's sexuality. There's a lot on erections and erection problems. There's a lot on early ejaculation, or what used to be called premature ejaculation. But qualitative research, there was very little. That goes back to the idea that erection is the be all and end all, that's all you need.
Another goal of this project, and why I'm so interested in this, because I want to highlight or talk to people who are doing the work to highlight and redefine sex for everyone in a more global way and as a range of behaviors and acts and activities, because it's hurting. These narrow definitions are hurting everyone, not just women, but men too. And a lot of people are frustrated, and it's damaging relationships.
Yeah.
And I know that your time is limited. I interrupted you with when you were talking about even the score. So I wanted to go back to that if you wanted to finish that, and also make sure I talk a little bit about the media. Because in that paper, I'm always happy when people call out the media constructively in telling us where we go wrong, because we have a lot to learn. We are also products of the era that we popped up into and the part of the world we popped up into. So yeah, so I'd like to talk about that, but I wanted you to finish if you wanted to about even the score.
But even the score, I think, had quite a sway in terms of the FDA. I mean, it was talked about, discussed even at the hearings. But I think what came across there was that those who opposed approving this drug, and I was certainly one of them, were kind of accused of not wanting to provide treatment for women. So that disregards the fact that I know it's not easily accessible always, but there are psychological treatments. There are even some quite effective self-help things and books that you can read that really do transform women's sexuality. Things like Emily Nagoski's Come As You Are, for example, which was based on a lot of research that was done here. So I think the narrative that I was quite shocked by what some of the women in even the score said, because it really did bring home the idea that sex should be perfect. And they wanted it back to like it was when they first met their partner in those first few weeks. And we know it doesn't happen like that. And it's understandable but it doesn't necessarily get terrible. It just changes. And you, with knowledge, and in our research with older adults, and I've done some in Europe and now some here, we hear people say, yes, sex has changed, right? And we have less emphasis. A lot of them say we have less emphasis on penetrative sex, but we actually are enjoying each other more. I feel more close and intimate. We're trying things we never did before, freed from worrying about pregnancy, which, inhibits a lot of people. That's been great. Not having kids at home, that's been great. Now, again, not everybody says this who are older adults, but a lot do. And some of them will start, self-pleasuring themselves for the first time, start using sex toys. So it's really, that's a bad stereotype that sex and aging always means negative things. And that's still around.
That has a lot to do with ageism in general. This idea that accumulated experience and accumulated knowledge, we don't think of it in those terms. I mean, the more you know about things, and especially the more you know about your body and what you like, why wouldn't it get better?
I know. And a few of our earlier studies, which had a mixed age range, also bore that out as well. With the women who were in one study, it's quite a young range, 46, but they went up to 82, so quite older. They talked about being much more focused on knowing what they liked sexually and what turned them on. The younger women, 18 to 24 was that age group. They talked a lot about it was focused on the partner.
Mm.
We found it really interesting, focused a lot on physical attributes like grooming and whether they wore socks in bed. And the older women were much more, it's about my mood and what, so what you just said, absolutely agree with. There's a concept called, I'm going to forget who put this word, called sexual wisdom. I think I do know who put that forward, Australian researcher. But I think that also holds true. And we've done some research lately looking at, I don't really like the term, but I've done this with a group of European researchers, successful sexual aging. And what that means, it doesn't mean always being able to have an orgasm, because that's not necessarily successful. That's not, but so I agree with there. And the other thing you asked about, forgetting.
The media in that paper, you talked about how the news media and journalists have just ran with that 43% sexual dysfunction. And we like statistics, right? But we don't often know how to parse the data well. You have to understand an issue really, really well, as I teach students as well.
To be fair, researchers have really done that too. That paper, if you look it up, has thousands, I really mean thousands of citations.
That breaks my heart.
It's such better research it's really a shame that that's still coming out. I speak to the media quite a lot, and most of my experiences with the media are really good. Start off with that. I think it's unfortunate sometimes, doesn't happen very often, but it does sometimes, if a journalist wants to speak to you and interviews you about something that they have read nothing about. And so they know none of the sort of context. And so sometimes in that, they will come in with some real assumptions and stereotypes. And that's one thing. I like it when it's a conversation like this. This is, and rather than having a strict sort of set of questions that you can't, I think it makes it more interesting. I like it when journalists fact check quotes a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, of course.
There's only one or two publications that I wouldn't speak to now because I've had bad experiences.
Do you want to name them?
Yeah, I don't mind doing that. A couple of I lived in the UK for a long time, right? 35 plus years on and off. I came back to Canada, came back to this, moved around a lot. A couple of the tabloid newspapers in the UK are really pretty bad. And interestingly, just tell you an anecdote is that when I finished my PhD, which I did in Montreal at McGill University, my first really big study, found a lower interest and enjoyment in sex on the pill. It was a careful study, wasn't huge in numbers, but it was controlled. So it was placebo controlled. I spoke to a journalist, probably one of the first, I was really young then too, one of the first times I did about this study. And I think it was the first media contact I had for anything. And at the end of it, I said, oh, so are you going to do, really naive, are you going to do a paper on this, or an article on this? And he said, it'll be in the mail tomorrow, be in the mail the next day. And the headlines were terrible. And he exaggerated things I said, made it seem like all women on the pill were turned off sexually. So the headlines were things like pills turns girls off sex, the chill pill and stuff. Things like that bother me because I really do not want the research that I do to put across the idea that I'm bashing the pill. And there is a lot of that right now, especially on social media and Instagram. So I didn't like that. And then the article went viral. It was in Brazilian newspapers. It was right across the States.
Oh, God.
I was in Montreal then. So I became much more careful. But I have some colleagues that don't actually speak to the media, not many, but some, whereas I think it's really important to, because I think it's important that we get the research findings don't just stay in the scientific journals. We communicate them, but accurately.
Yeah.
Not, pill turns girls off sex. There are so many times when pill scares, understandably, have led to drop-offs where women stop the pill, don't use any other method. And we've seen in the UK, I know we've seen big increases in pregnancy the following kind of year. And some of those scares are really understandable, breast cancer worries and stuff like that, but they're often exaggerated in the press. And the nuances of the findings, again, are not there. Some of the press around these two new drugs were misleading, I think, as well.
So you can't have any alcohol whatsoever. Is that, it's a pill that you take consistently, or is it a one-off like Viagra?
No, it's not a one-off. It's a pill that you take consistency. That's a good point, actually, that it's something that's, you've got to remember to take every day. It's definitely no alcohol, but I mean, I think realistically, anybody working on that would know that wouldn't happen.
Right.
Drinking alcohol would exacerbate or intensify some of the side effects, which were things like, for one of them was sleepiness, but there were other side effects too. But the main thing about those drugs is the actual efficacy is really pretty low. So you've got to balance, right, with anything. I think all drugs have side effects of some kind, but is it worth? But the way it was hyped up,
right,
and the way it was, this is what we've been looking for. Here's the pink, they still call it pink Viagra. It was nothing like Viagra. And I'm sure there are other drugs. I'd actually been a bit out of touch. I'm sure there are some other drugs in development.
If it works on arousal, and I'll be honest, I've never heard of this, but it sounds more like ecstasy than.
It doesn't actually work on arousal. It works on interest, desire. This is a whole other area, but there are people, including myself, that say that they're not really that distinct. One doesn't always come before the other. Women find it hard to separate the two qualitatively. And in fact, for the DSM, we've now combined them in terms of one disorder. It's sexual interest / sexual arousal disorder
Mm.
because they overlap a lot. And the other diagnosis for sexual arousal disorder was rarely used on its own without also having desire disorder. So all kinds of reasons that they were combined.
I'm glad to hear that the DSM is being updated. I have a lot of thoughts on the DSM as well.
The DSM was updated. There's no plan to do, and I'm on a review committee for DSM, and there's no plan to have DSM 6 as yet. And it's been over 10 years.
Okay.
So I think what they're thinking about now is to revise the text. So they already done that once. They have DSM 5 TR text revised. It did improve a lot in 2013. I know it's a long time ago, but I mean, some of the improvements were to increase the severity criteria, to increase the duration. Distress was already required before that. To expand, I mean, you'd like this, I'm sure, from what you're saying, expand the criteria.
Yes.
We know that people respond to sexual initiatives in different ways. It doesn't have to be something that you think first and you initiate. Doesn't mean you have a disorder.
Right. Of course not.
The pain one expanded by focusing not just on pain, but on fear of pain, which is a huge thing in terms of women that have various different kinds of sexual pain problems, that they won't even go there, because they've had bad experiences with painful sex.
Yeah.
So I think it's a lot better. It's not perfect.
Last question. I want to be mindful of your time. Have you created the guidance that you talked about in that paper I mentioned at the beginning for journalists? And if not, can we create one together?
I haven't. And I remember writing that. I do remember. I remember the two authors I worked with were great, by the way. Petra Boynton was one of them. And she's wonderful. I have not done. I would be interested in doing that. Absolutely. Camilla would be very interested in doing that too. Our director for strategic communications would be really interested. She's great.
I would love to do that. I have a guide that I've created for improving gender violence coverage because my wheelhouse as a reporter is gender violence. I teach it in classrooms as well, but really I'm interested in bringing it to more and more newsrooms, explaining to people, to my colleagues, why gender violence coverage is so bad. And a lot of that has to do with social norms. And how do we improve it? Even small tweaks can make a huge difference in stories.
I'd be interested. You can count me in. I think that's it. I think it's really important. And a lot of times I think it's just lack of information, in terms of how to approach researchers and how to structure an interview, things like that.
I would argue it's a combination of lack of information, especially if you're working under a tight deadline. If you're a generalist reporter and one day you're doing one story and another, you just don't have the time to do deep research. But also, as I teach, often our biggest enemies, I think, as reporters, are our unconscious biases, our unquestioned assumptions that we have about the world. And if I go into an interview thinking sex is penis and vagina and the man has to orgasm, I'm already thinking about heterosex. I'm already not thinking necessarily about the woman. So yeah, the questions I ask you aren't going to be great.
Agree with that completely. Yeah. And researchers also have biases too. As well.
Of course.
A lot of the research community in sex research now, I think that the quality of research has improved for sure. Years ago, most people submitting to the journal that I'm editor for, it was undergraduate psychology student samples. That has really changed. I've been doing this for 15 years as editor, and you can absolutely say that reviewers of articles will say, we've seen enough of the undergrad psychology, and that's changed. There's much more in the way of nationally represented, there aren't a lot, but nationally representative samples, but also more qualitative work. I said that as well. There's still quite a cultural bias in terms of North American or Western European. So there's a way to go, but things are improving, I think, overall.
We can end on that optimistic note, on that positive note.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. That was Dr. Cynthia Graham, a distinguished professor of gender studies at Indiana University and a senior scientist at the Kinsey Institute, one of the world's most renowned centers for sex research. You can find a link to her work, the Kinsey Institute, and some other things we talk about on the episodes page of womenlikesex.com, episode 5. Women Like Sex is a flipped script production. It is executive produced and edited by me, Natasha Stojanovic. Website design and artwork is by Ted Nunez. Edesio Martinez is associate producer. For more episodes and swag, or to subscribe to the podcast or Patreon, please visit womenlikesex.com, the Women Like Sex YouTube channel, or wherever you get your podcasts. This is Women Like Sex. Pass it on.